cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be.
Is there a God? That seems like a very strange question to ask in a church. And particularly a strange question to ask in a church when I have two people in attendance who are both good Christians and know the answer to the question. But it's a very important question. As you heard in the audio at the very beginning, Carl Sagan, a well-known and widely respected atheist, taught on public television that the only thing there ever was the cosmos, the universe, that we live inside a box of material, and outside of that box there is nothing. Particularly, there is no God. And so as that belief has spread, it's become the fastest growing religion in America today. I'm going to show you a graph. We're not going to spend a lot of time thinking about it, but this is how faith segments have looked over the last 18 or 19 years. And the first line we look at is the thing that we would call legacy evangelicals, Southern Baptist, Assembly of God, other churches that are very evangelical in their nature. And they've stayed steady right at around 7% of the total population. The next two lines show the born-again Christians, people that self-identify, that if they take a survey, if you ask them, they say, we are Christians, we're born again. And the top line, the kind of the faded blue, are the nominal Christians, people that say if you ask them, we're a Christian, but they would not claim to be born again. That might include Catholics, maybe some Lutherans, some other faiths, and lots of people. And so everything that they say would be Christian in nature, but it wouldn't be born-again Christians. But you notice that the born-again Christians have been declining steadily, and they're down to about 26% of the population. The last line, excuse me, not the last line, the next last line, these are the other religions. These are the Islam and the Buddhists and the Hindus. And then finally, the atheist, lumped together with agnostics and the nuns, the people that claim they have no religious affiliation, which from a belief standpoint equates to atheism. If you don't have any religious affiliation, you don't believe in God. And you see that line is growing. When they get the statistics for 2021, which is the next year the survey is scheduled to be taken, it is likely that the nuns will greatly exceed the born-again Christians. Estimates are they'll be about 10% higher than the born-again Christians. Now that could change. The pandemic might have scared people enough that that trend will be reversed. But everything we see right now indicates that there will be more atheists in America than there will be born-again Christians. So as Christians, we have to know how to deal with those atheists, how to relate to the atheists, how to properly share the good news with them in a manner that they don't find offensive. And the odds are that you will talk to one in the next week. If you're out and about today on one of the teams, the odds are you will talk to somebody that fits in that category of atheists, agnostics, or nuns. Excuse me. Those people don't believe that there's a God, or they don't know if there's a God, or probably the worst of all, they're just so disinterested that they don't even think about whether or not there's a God. Now, quite honestly, it's easier to deal with the first one, those that absolutely know they don't believe in a God, than it is with those who just don't care and don't even want to think about it. Because at least the top bracket will be willing to engage and discuss with you. So are you prepared? Are you ready to deal with that individual who comes and challenges your belief in God? Well, to do that, we got to start out someplace. And so a good place always to start is with some definitions. And the first one we want to look at is, who is an atheist? Or what is an atheist? And there are, like Christians, there are many different categories of atheists. And we're going to look at it in terms of 4 different categories this morning. First, there's the person whose worldview, or more precisely, their noetic structure, includes the absence of God in their belief, the rejection of a belief that there is a deity or deities, or the position that there is no such thing as a deity. Atheist comes from the Greek word which means without God. And it is a matter of our worldview that determines whether or not we're an atheist, not what we say with our lips. The worldview, for those that aren't familiar with the term, is the sum total of everything that you believe about the world. It concludes such interesting facts as your belief that the Washington football team will go undefeated this year. Now, they've already lost the game, and so we know that isn't true, but that can be in your worldview. People can have a worldview that says their team is going to win even when they've lost. And everything is in that you believe about the world is in that worldview, but not everything in the worldview is equally important. And so within that worldview, we talk about a noetic structure. The noetic structure is that set of questions about the most important things in the world to you. Usually it includes, what's the purpose of life? What happens when I die? What happens to my loved ones when I die? Is there a God? What is the best thing that I can do for human beings? And questions like that are the noetic structure. And when they don't include a deity, you would be called an atheist. And that is by evidence of the way you live, not by what you say. So the first thing we can say about atheists is you will talk to many atheists who claim to believe in God, but don't. Because it's fashionable to say you believe in God. It's not politically correct in some situations to say, I don't believe in God. There is no God. But many people will be in that situation. So the 4 categories of atheists that we want to talk about are, first of all, the fundamentalist. Just like there are fundamentalist Christians, there are fundamentalist atheists. And the fundamentalist atheists are the ones that push their form of religion, atheism. They're very emotionally committed, dedicated to their belief that there is no God. And that would include such well-known individuals as Richard Dawkins, Carl Sagan, and Stephen Hawking. All individuals who have been atheists and have promoted their beliefs in the media, on television, in the papers and publications, and in the classroom. And many teachers have learned from them. Often, these individuals are referred to by the Greek word that means a Christian, a meaning against, or anti-Christians. These are the individuals that will actively lobby against the Christian faith. They're the individuals that will go into a debate and call a Christian an idiot for believing what they believe. So those are the fundamentalist atheists. Then you have a group of atheists that are the functional atheists. These are the individuals that say they believe, but live a life that clearly demonstrates they don't really believe in God. They don't exercise a belief, they just have a verbal belief. Their noetic structure absolutely does not include belief in God, because by definition of the Noetic structure, if it did, they would live as if there was a God. They wouldn't say they're an atheist. They might say they're an agnostic. But then there's the agnostics, which is the third category. And those are the without knowledge. These are the individuals that say, we just don't know whether there's a God or not. In the past 50 years, the most important of those was a guy by the name of Russell, who wrote extensively on the lack of knowledge about God. And when asked, what would you do if you were confronted by God on the street? And he said, here I am, I'm God. And Russell's answer was, and God asked, why didn't you believe in me? Russell's answer would be, because you didn't provide enough evidence. And this is a group that wants evidence, but usually refuses to accept the evidence that they see. And so they're really more atheists than they want to admit. But they want to reserve the right to say that they just don't know. And then finally, the sad group. There are the Christian atheists. Individuals that come to church, that claim to be Christians, but live as if there is no God. And when we talk about those, we have to go back and look at the Bible. And I told you there were no Bible verses, so we're not going to read the verses here. But the Bible tells us very clearly that idolatry, worship of something other than God, is a big sin. In fact, the Bible talks much more about idolatry than it ever does about atheism itself. Very few passages that talk about atheism. So when we're worshiping the wrong God, or if we worship the right God but in the wrong way, and the nation of Israel was guilty of this, and God chastised them very strongly because they were making offerings, but they weren't doing what God wanted. They weren't taking care of the poor and the widows, and their heart wasn't in it. Those individuals fall into the category of atheists as well. And we have to deal with each of these categories very differently. And we're going to talk primarily about how to deal with the first three, because dealing with the Christian atheist is a different situation altogether. So if there are categories of atheists, the next logical question that we might ask ourselves is, what do atheists believe? Well, we know what they don't believe, but what do they believe? You will not probably ever encounter an atheist that has all of the beliefs shown on this chart. But if you talk to enough atheists, over time you will find all of these beliefs mentioned. They do not believe that atheism is a faith or a belief. They will tell you it's an absence of a belief. But in fact, when you look at how they live their lives and the noetic structure, it really is a belief. They would tell you that if God exists, if it's the God of the Bible, he's an ogre. He's a mean, awful individual. They will tell you that atheism is the default position for humanity. Left to our own devices, we will all be atheists, they would say. It's the scientific position. If you're intelligent, if you're smart, you're going to be an atheist. It's based on reason. It sets people free. It's the progressive position in society. If you want to be in the in crowd, you're going to be an atheist. They would tell you that sometimes atheists do bad things because they can't very well argue that point. There's lots of evidence that atheists do bad things, but that they do that in spite of their atheism, not because of their atheism. They would tell you that human beings are fundamentally good creatures. Left to our own devices, we will on our own do good. But sometimes, because they recognize things do go bad, sometimes life just sucks. It's bad. You can't get around that point. And that if we're human beings and we're atheists, we're on the road to nowhere. When we die, that's the end. There is no life after death. So that's what they believe about themselves, but they also believe something about Christians. And their set of beliefs about Christians is almost identically opposite of what they believe about themselves. And you can take that first list and you can almost see a mirror image. Christianity is the belief in a fairy tale. Now, we're going to have a happy ending no matter what the bad part of the book is. The Bible is written by a bunch of illiterate shepherds who didn't know what they were doing and were very barbaric in their culture. And we shouldn't pay any attention to it. Christians themselves are bigoted fanatics and a bit dumb. We don't have the common sense it takes to come in out of the rain. We're against science. No matter what the science is, we're against it. The Christianity is always, in their view, based, and they're not entirely wrong here, there is always based on revelation, not on reason. And most of us would agree that's pretty accurate. But that Christianity has trapped us into a set of beliefs that prevent us from doing what we should do. And that Christians sometimes do good things, but the good things we do is in spite of our Christianity rather than because of our Christianity. We would do them even if we weren't Christians. They would tell you that Jesus is probably a good person if they believe he existed, but he wasn't necessary. We don't need Jesus. And suffering, we're going to talk about this a little bit more later, suffering proves that the God of the Bible does not exist. So that set of beliefs about Christians is a reflection of, or a mirror image of what they think about themselves. So how do we deal with somebody that has those kind of beliefs, that feel that negatively about us? Well, the first thing to do when you meet an atheist and you have enough of a relationship to have a meaningful discussion is to ask them a very simple question. Please tell me about this God that you don't believe in. If you don't believe in him, what is it you don't believe in? Describe that individual to me. And when they do that, almost always, you're going to be able to come back and say, I probably don't believe in that God, or I maybe more definite than that, I don't at all believe in that God. That's not my God. What you're describing is not what the Bible describes. It's not what I believe, and so I don't believe it either. And so if you don't believe that, we're in good common ground. We got a place to go forward and have a discussion. And that would be a good place to start. So you have to say that, to say, I probably don't believe in that God, or I definitely don't believe in that God, or that God you described isn't in the Bible. We have to know what God is. We have to have our own understanding well grounded in what the Bible tells us. So a definition of God, it's hard to write a definition of God, but God is a metaphysical being that has all the attributes described in the Bible. Okay? He's metaphysical. Very important part of the discussion. God is not part of the material world. God created the material world. He exists outside of, above and beyond, whatever word you want to use, the material world. He's metaphysical. That sounds weird, but it's a true, absolutely true statement that we have to keep in mind. And he has all, emphasis on the word all of the attributes that are described in the Bible. And there are lots of attributes of God that are described or derived from the biblical text, and we aren't going to try to cover them today, but here's a list of many of them, certainly not all of them. In fact, because of the very first attribute, God is infinite, God, by definition, has to have an infinite number of attributes. And since we aren't infinite, we will never, ever understand all of God's attributes. But God has chosen to give us some of them. He's immutable, self-sufficient, omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent, and all-wise. Faithful, sovereign, good, just, merciful, gracious, loving, holy, gracious. I think I got gracious twice for some reason. Or glorious, self-existent, and he has impassibility. All of those are important attributes of God. And if you take away one of those, God ceases to be what he says he is in the Bible. And so as Christians, we have to insist that the God that we're going to talk about has all of those attributes. And that will become important as we go forward in this discussion. Now, you don't have to be an expert in all of those attributes. You don't even have to know all of those attributes. You just have to understand that what the Bible says about God is how we are going to define God. We're not going to allow the atheist to set the definition of what we believe in. We're going to believe in the God of the Bible. And if we want to talk about, is there a God, that's what we're going to talk about. We're not going to talk about, is there a multitude of gods, or a duality of gods, or a plurality of gods, or any of the other worldviews that have different types of God. We're going to talk about the God that exists in the Bible. So with that kind of introduction, here's the statement that people get up and walk out of the class on. There can be no philosophical or logical proof for the existence of God. Say it in another way. You cannot prove that God exists. Okay, why can we say that? It's pretty obvious when you think about it after a couple minutes, and the slide works. Since God is metaphysical, he transcends the physical world that we live in, and any argument that we can make can only be based on the physical world. It has to be flawed. Our arguments from the physical to the metaphysical never can work. And so when we try to argue from the physical world to prove that there's a God, that fails. It fails logical tests. And any atheist has been well versed in the logic, and he can point out the flaws of those kinds of proofs. He also is infinite and absolute, and we are neither. And so when we argue to prove God, we're arguing from a finite, restricted viewpoint, trying to prove something that's infinite, and that will fail logically. And so there can be no philosophical or logical proof that God exists. Now that in itself shouldn't bother us, because philosophers will tell you there is no proof for any philosophical attribute. Everything that's philosophical can only be suggested. It can never be proven, because it suffers from some of these same types of issues. It's not physical. But the other side of the coin, and that's the other side that we can never forget, is there can be no philosophical or logical proof that God does not exist. Because the same things that restrict us from proving that he does exist restrict the atheist from proving that he does not exist. And that's very important, because the atheist will try to force you to prove that he exists, and you should turn that coin around and say, well, how can you prove he does not exist? And they will fail the same way we would. So out of that come two very important follow-ups. First, the absence of proof does not prevent us from believing things. We believe a huge number of things, rightly believe a huge number of things that we have no proof for. And if we didn't have that nature, life as we know it could not exist. If we could only live based on what we can prove, it would be a very sad, boring, terrible existence. The other thing is that if God exists, if the God that we described exists, I can only know about him what he chooses to reveal to me. I can never find anything out about God that he has not chosen to reveal about himself, because he is outside the world. And for me to find outside the material world, for me to find anything out, he's got to inject something into that material world that I can learn. And so I can only know what he chooses to reveal. So we're going to come back to those two points in just a minute. But first, I want to jump back to that statement that we can't prove that God does not exist. The way that most people go about that, it has been to suggest some kind of a logical argument that God does not exist. And the most common form of that argument is the problem of pain, suffering, and evil. And in fact, many, both Christian and non-Christian philosophers have said in writing that if you abandon the Christian faith for any other reason than the problem of pain, suffering, and evil, you haven't done your homework. But when you come to the problem of pain, suffering, and evil, you've got every reason in the world to abandon your belief in God. So the problem goes something like this, and there's lots of different ways to formulate it. But one we're going to look at is the simplest of the statements. And all-loving God would not want his children to suffer. Premise 2, an all-knowing God, both of these are attributes we saw on the list now. An all-knowing God would know how to prevent pain. An all-powerful God would have the ability to do what he knows how to do. But there's pain, suffering, and evil in the world, and nobody will deny that. Therefore, God cannot exist. Now, that is a valid, logical argument if the premises are true. An all-powerful God would be able to prevent pain. I don't think we can argue with that. If God is all-powerful, he could prevent pain. In fact, he could eliminate all pain and suffering this instant by eliminating the human race. That's within his power, and it would eliminate pain, suffering, and evil. And all-knowing God would know how to do that. In fact, we have seen at least one case in the Bible where he did that pretty much. He flooded the earth, killed everything except for one family and some animals in an ark. So God could know how to do it. The first premise, though, an all-loving God would not want his children to suffer. There's where the argument breaks down. How can we, as finite individuals, know what an infinite God would want to do? And how could we know that when he allows us to suffer on this earth, it isn't for a greater purpose? And even if you don't believe God does that, logically, you can't prove that he doesn't because you are not omnipotent. You don't know everything that God thinks and does. And so the fallacy in the argument is the first premise. And when we think through that first premise, it really shouldn't surprise us. God may very well want us to suffer because we want our children to suffer. We don't want them to hurt, but we take them to the doctor and they suffer at times because we know it's for their greater good. We take them and they get shots and they don't like shots. They suffer. Or we make them do their homework when they would rather be outside playing. We do lots of things that in their view make them suffer, but in our view, it's for their good. And God, being infinitely greater than us, has every right to do the same things for us. And so you can easily see that this argument fails because God may choose to do that. And in fact, most philosophers, most atheistic philosophers, have rejected this form of the argument because they realize that that first sentence cannot be proven. They can't prove that God doesn't do that. But that is replaced by the problem of gratuitous evil. What about evil that has no purpose whatsoever? That the infant child that dies a slow, painful, agonizing death from cancer. The family who loses a new mother in a drunken driving accident when she wasn't at fault. A dictator in Germany that exterminates Jews. You can go on and on. Or how about natural ones? Earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes. There's all kinds of things that appear to be gratuitous. And the atheistic philosopher would argue that even if God does things to his people on purpose, there are things that are gratuitous. And if there's gratuitous evil in the world, then God cannot exist because he would not allow gratuitous evil. Well, that fails for exactly the same reason. How do we, as finite beings, know that all evil is any single evil, and all you have to do is prove that one, if there's one gratuitous evil, then the argument holds. How do we prove that no gratuitous evil exists? Well, we can't, except for the fact that they can't prove that it does. How do we know that some evil doesn't serve a good and meaningful purpose? And so we cannot accept that argument that gratuitous evil proves that God does not exist. A classic example of the discussion would go something like, Hitler's extermination of the Jews was gratuitous evil. And we would all agree it was evil. And it's very hard to look at that and say that anything good could possibly have come out of it. But when you look back on history, one of the things that came out of that event was the establishment of the nation of Israel. Maybe that was what God needed to happen. I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying, that we don't know. We aren't omnipotent. But you can find things, and if you wait long enough and look back in history from a distant enough perspective, you get a very different view than when you're looking at it right up close. So, are we at a stalemate? We can't prove that God exists, and they can't prove that God doesn't exist. Well, that wouldn't seem like a good position to be in, but actually we're not quite at a stalemate yet. The absence of a proof does not prevent us from believing things. That was one of those two statements I showed you on an earlier chart. The absence of proof does not prevent us from believing lots of different things. I absolutely believe that my wife loves me. There is no doubt in my mind whatsoever that Chris loves me, but I can't prove it. I can't prove that she loves me. A proof would go something like, if a person loves someone, they will, and you fill in the blank. Chris, whatever that blank is, does that for me. Therefore, Chris loves me. That would be a valid proof, logical proof that Chris loves me. The trouble is, I can't fill in the blank. If a person loves someone, they will wash their dishes. Chris washes my dishes. Therefore, she loves me. But wait a minute, people wash dishes for other reasons. She would wash my clothes. She would do anything you put in that blank. I can find somebody that would do that same thing for a different reason other than love. Well, you say, well, what about what Jesus taught? No greater love has any man than he lay down his life for his fellow. Okay? So there was a Bible verse. A person loves someone, they will die for them. Chris would die for me. Therefore, Chris loves me. But now the second statement is wrong, because I don't know that Chris would die for me. I think I know that, but until Chris actually died for me, I can't say that she would die for me because it's in the future and I don't know what the future holds. So there is no logical proof. No way that I can prove that she loves me, but I absolutely know it. There is no doubt in my mind whatsoever. And if you talk to an atheist about the same type of subject, they would agree that their wife loves them or their husband loves them. So love is one. Another one, beauty. Can you prove something is beautiful? No, because we actually have a saying about that. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. What you think is beautiful, I might not. Somebody might look at this segment of the Sistine Chapel and say, that's the ugliest thing I've ever seen. Where others, art lovers, would say, that's one of the most beautiful paintings that's ever been made. So we can't prove beauty. What else? What else? Go to the physical world. Almost everybody believes in black holes. And all astronomers believe in black holes. But nobody can prove that a black hole exists. They can show you evidence that they think suggests it exists, but a black hole is defined by an event horizon. And anything that crosses that horizon can never leave. Any information that goes in cannot come out. And so there is no way to know that there is a black hole to prove it. And it raises some interesting questions that astronomers struggle with. Although they believe in them, why haven't black holes consumed the entire universe? Physics would seem to suggest they should. So we don't know why, but we do believe in them. We believe in the law of uniformity. Law of uniformity is the law that governs all science. It says that when an event occurred one way in the past, it's going to occur that way in the future. If that wasn't true, we couldn't do science. If everything was random and did everything differently, we wouldn't know how to prove anything. But how do we prove that law? How do you prove the law of uniformity as it applies to the rising of the sun in the east? How do we know that tomorrow the sun won't rise in the west? Well, experience tells us it won't, but we don't know the future, so we can't prove that law. We accept that law, and we base every bit, literally without exception, every bit of our science is based on that law, the law of uniformity, but we can't prove it. And so there's lots of things like that. So that's why we believe in things that we can believe in things that we can't prove. But the second statement I showed you earlier was that we can only know about God what he's revealed to us, and he's revealed an awful lot. And so let's look at a couple of the big things he's revealed. First, he's revealed his universe. Okay? And scientists are convinced now, what the Bible has always taught, that the universe had a start. It had a point in time, about 13.5 billion years ago, by their count, when it started, and they call that the Big Bang. But what caused the Big Bang? If they describe it, the entire universe that we know came from nothing, for no reason. Well, experience tells us nothing and no reason don't result in anything. And so how come? How did everything come into being? The very existence of the universe with a start tends to confirm God's existence. 50 years ago, 75 years ago, before Hubble, the scientists, not the telescope, scientists thought the universe had existed forever and would exist forever. And then he found out that the universe is expanding, which led them to realize that, well, if it's expanding, it expanded, and they trace it back to the Big Bang. And so they have learned something that God revealed. The universe started. But it didn't just start. The universe is a fine-tuned, complex structure. when the Big Bang occurred, if the mass that happened was 1/10 trillionth of a part different than it actually was, the universe would have collapsed back in on itself or exploded into nothingness. It was that finely tuned, more detail than we can do in any scientific experience. The solar system shows the same fine tuning. If Earth was any place other than where it is in the solar system, we couldn't live. But it's exactly the right spot for human life and other life as we know it. And so he fine-tuned the universe. That entire universe operates on a uniform set of laws that make it possible for things to happen. The speed of light, 186,000 miles per second, is constant throughout the universe. If it wasn't, the universe wouldn't exist the way we know it today. And so God's revealed, and there's a lot more. We don't have time to go through the entire cosmological argument for God, but there's all kinds of things in the universe that show that it was not an accident, that it was designed, that it was created with a design. Now, that doesn't prove that the God of the Bible did it. It just proves that something designed it. But it's one piece of proof or one evidence. Then he showed us some evidence. He revealed things about himself in the little things. That was the big picture. Let's go down and look at the other side of the coin, the little picture. Everybody has heard about DNA. DNA is the structure that makes life on Earth possible. Every bit of life that we've ever found has DNA. The atheist, Richard Dawkins, who is a brilliant scientist, but was a brilliant scientist, tells us that a single strand of DNA in one cell contains enough information to fill 4,500 page books. That would fill this room, okay? 4,500 page books of information encoded on DNA. Okay? Now, if you walk into a library, or if you take a child into a library and they see the books, they realize right away that something intelligent put those books there. The books didn't just happen to jump onto the shelves magically by themselves. Somebody wrote the books, somebody published the books, and somebody put the books in an order on the shelves. Well, that's what we see in DNA. It was, by all apparent purposes, it was designed. It was put together specifically to communicate information. And so that's a very, very powerful argument for a designer doing something. Again, it does not necessarily prove that our God exists, but it proves that something, or it suggests strongly that something designed life. Oh, come on. This is going to be one of those days. What did I just do? What did I just do? There. Going a little bit bigger than DNA in a cell, we find incidences of irreducible complexity. And this is a very important aspect of talking to atheists, particularly atheists that are believers, and they almost all are, in evolution. Darwin, when he wrote his book, said that if you could ever demonstrate an organ that was irreducibly complex, it would prove that his theories were false. By irreducibly complex, he means something that is put together in such a manner that it could not happen in slow steps. Well, a book was written a few years ago about Darwin's black box that demonstrated at least 6 different incidences in every cell of irreducible complexity, and a whole bunch of them be above the cellular level. For example, blood clotting. Blood clots to keep us from dying. But the mechanism that causes the clotting could not have evolved because we would all bled to death before it evolved. And he can show that scientifically. But the example in the Darwin's Black Box book that is so telling is the example of a mousetrap. A mousetrap is an example of a machine of irreducible complexity. If you look at that mousetrap, it's only got a few parts, but every part is absolutely necessary and has to be arranged just perfectly to make that mousetrap work. And if you don't think it has to be arranged perfectly, try setting a mousetrap where it's not aligned properly and watch your finger get snapped. It's got to be set perfectly together, and it has to have every part. You can't catch a mousetrap with just the wooden base, or the wooden base in the spring, or the wooden base in the spring and the plunger. You got to have all the parts together in the right order, and you couldn't have evolved that. It is a irreducibly complex system. Well, within the cell, there are lots of those. For example, any cell that has a whip-like structure, a flagella that causes it to move, and there's lots of cells in your lungs that do that. Male sperm does that. The motor that drives that cell, a molecular motor, is uniquely designed and requires every part to work. If you take away one part, one set of molecules, the motor won't work. And so there is irreducible complexity, which again suggests design. Machines like that don't just happen, somebody builds them. And of course, we've all heard the argument about finding the watch on the beach. And we're not going to talk about that one today, but that is another example. Then he's revealed himself in some things that are intangible. And we talked about beauty already. You know, we can't prove beauty, show beauty. It just is, it's a concept. Morality. Where do we get our concept of what is right and wrong if it's not from God? Because many of the things, and it seems strange to say it in a church, but many of the things that we believe to be morally true would not be things that we would adopt if we were worried about survival of the fittest. We do things for others that cause ourselves to die in some cases. So morality. A belief in God. Where does the belief, an innate belief that is throughout mankind, throughout the world, where does that belief in God come from, if not from God himself? If God didn't implant that in us, where does it come from? So all of those are examples of what we would call experiential knowledge. Okay, an example of experiential knowledge. We all have watched a young child learn to walk, learn how to deal with gravity. Well, that's Newton's equation for how to deal with gravity. Right? It works. You can plug the numbers in. It works for anything of dealing with gravity. But I have never, ever heard of a child that went out and learned Newton's law of universal gravity and applied that so he could learn to walk. He learned to walk by experience. And in doing that, he learned to believe in gravity. He didn't have it proven to him. He believed in gravity long, long before he ever studied gravity in school. So that's experiential knowledge. And experiential knowledge plays a huge role when it comes to faith and belief. Most Christians will tell you that they believe in God because of their relationship with God. They are saved because of the experience that they went through. And they may not be able to describe it to you, but they can describe that they had such an experience. Their belief is experiential. And we accept that in every area of life except religion. And the atheists will try to shoot it down in religion. And so we should not allow that. You know, experiential knowledge is valid knowledge. And we accept it and we should live with it. So if God exists, I can only know about him what he chooses to reveal. The opponent will say, but that apparent revelation or the absence of that revelation doesn't prove anything. In every case that I've described, and hundreds more, they will say that's a leaky bucket. They can shoot arguments in it, and they can certainly say it doesn't prove the God of Christianity exists. And so a famous British atheist philosopher used the example, you can have all these leaky buckets you want. They're still leaky buckets. They don't hold water. But then somebody pointed out that I can hold water if I stack enough leaky buckets together in such a manner that the holes don't line up. And I push them down tight enough, that structure will hold water. And that's the logical argument. If we can show to ourselves and to our opponents enough of those intangible arguments, then we can build a good probabilistic case that God does exist. Does it prove that he exists? No. Why doesn't it prove that he exists? Why doesn't God allow us to prove that he exists? Because of how he wants us to come to him. He wants us to come to him by faith, not by proof. And so while we can show good arguments that he does exist, we will never be able to prove it, and it's not our job to prove it. So some suggestions for how to deal with atheists when you talk to them. First, when you're dealing with an atheist, use negative apologetics. Now that's a big term, but what it means is that you don't have to provide the proof, they do. The burden of proof is not on us as Christians, the burden of proof is on them. We're entitled to believe what we want to believe, and if they want to prove it's wrong, they have to prove it. In a court of law, it's up to the prosecutor to prove that the man is guilty. It's not up to, and at least in our system of law, it's not up to the defendant to prove that he's innocent. And that's the way we have to approach an atheist when we're dealing with a discussion about does God exist, is who's got the burden of proof. Don't allow yourself to accept the burden of proof because it's not ours to prove. You need to listen, ask questions, learn, and think about what the other person is saying. And all too often, that's where we fall short when we deal with atheists. We want to prove our point. We want to prove that God exists, and we don't listen to the other individual. And in most cases, an atheist has a reason for being an atheist. He didn't just decide one morning when he got out of bed, well, it's good morning to become an atheist. I'm going to prove God doesn't exist. Something happened in his life, somewhere in his life, that caused him not to believe in God. And if we can find out what that is, if we can get an inkling of what causes the individual not to believe, then we have a better chance of talking to them in a meaningful manner. So we need to listen. We need to ask meaningful questions. Starting with that question, describe the God that you don't believe in. Because many atheists can't even do that. They know they don't believe in God because somebody told them they didn't, but they can't describe what it is they don't believe in. Just, well, I don't believe in God. Well, force them to think about it. Learn yourself about what they're saying. It's very hard to argue, particularly or discuss with a fundamentalist atheist, unless you've thought through how to do logical argument, the science of logic, because they'll just shoot you down right and left if you don't know that. What about science? What do we know about science that proves that God exists and that we as Christians aren't rejecting science? And think about it. Make sure that when you're going into a discussion, you've thought through the arguments, the discussion points, and you're not just throwing things out left and right because you think it sounds good. Read reputable books on both sides of the subjects. If you only know one side of the issue, you're not going to be able to have a meaningful discussion. It's not quite identical, but it's kind of like trying to witness to a Muslim and never having read the Quran. You're going to tell me he should read the Bible, and his response, well, have you read the Quran? Well, you got to have both sides of that. And when you do that, you will find some interesting facts. Some things that we take for granted sometimes aren't true. For example, Einstein is widely viewed as being an atheist. But when you read Einstein's biography and you read about him, you find a quote where he says, I am not an atheist. And I don't think I could even call myself a pantheist. We are in the position of a little child entering the huge library filled with books in many languages. The child knows that someone must have written these books. He does not know how. The child dimly suggests an order, but he can't figure out the arrangement. That seems to be the case that we're in. So Einstein recognized the need for an intelligent creator. He was probably not a Christian. There's no reason to believe he was, but he was not an atheist. And many other scientists fit in that same category. When we deal with atheists, we've got to learn to communicate and not to preach. Nothing will turn an individual off as fast as preaching to them. We got to communicate, and communication is always two-way. It's not me talking, it's both of us discussing. We have to start where the atheist is, not where we want him to go or her to go. So we want them to become a Christian. We want them to believe in the Bible, but that may not be the place where we can start. We start with what we can have a common ground. So again, I go back to that question I've mentioned a couple times now. Tell me about the God you don't believe in. Establish a common ground, someplace that you can have something in agreement to start your discussion, and then work from there. Most important, well, maybe not most, one of the most important is we've got to love them. It's very easy to not love someone who is calling you an idiot for believing what you believe, who's belittling you, making you look foolish for believing. It's very hard to love somebody like Stephen Hawking or Richard Dawkins, who go on TV and tell the world that Christians are insane for believing in God. But our command from God is to love. And if we love the atheist, we're well on our way to doing something. If we don't love him, we probably aren't even going to have a discussion in the first place. Then we're moving down to more important. I said love was, but more important than love is pray. And you can't do one without the other. If you've got an atheist friend, pray for that individual. And the more you pray for them, the more you're going to love them. The more you love them, the more you're going to pray for them. And that's something we often ignore. We get caught up in here are 10 steps to dealing with an atheist, and we forget the most important one, pray. Counterintuitively, use the Bible. The Bible is God's word, and God said that his word would not fail. It would not return to him void. And so we want to encourage atheists to read the Bible. Often they'll tell you how bad the Bible is, and when you ask, have you ever read it? No. Well, how can you say it's terrible if you've never read it? Or they've read it a few chapters or a few verses or something. So get them to read the Bible and start in some unusual places. A great place to start with an atheist in reading the Bible is in Ecclesiastes, because it talks about things they can identify with. And once they find the truth in Ecclesiastes, then you can move on. Psalms is always a good place to start with an atheist. And if you want to go to the New Testament, Luke, because Luke is written as a historical document. And so an intellectual individual will look at that and say, well, there's got to be something here. And Luke leads, of course, to Acts. And if somebody reads Luke and Acts, you're going to have a good chance of seeing them accept Christ. But remember that at some point you have to walk away. It is not up to you and I to win anybody to God. It's up to you and I to present the truth to the best of our ability, to the best of the Spirit's leading. But it's God's job, it's the Holy Spirit's job to convict the individual. And so when you've done what you can, don't get frustrated. Just recognize that you've done what you were supposed to do and walk away and leave it in God's hands. Let God do his work. So that is the end of the presentation, but we got a little bit of time for discussion and questions if anybody has any